Imagine this, a time when your neighbor might kill you just because of your faith. A time when kings would start wars in the name of God, and the whole map of Europe was basically redrawn in blood. For over 100 years, this was the reality. Today, we're going to unpack that era, the wars of religion.
So, how did things get so bad? Well, it all started with the Protestant Reformation, right? That completely shattered the religious unity of Europe. But here's the thing. It was never just about faith. Not really. It was about power, it was about land, and it was about these absolute titans clashing and being willing to spill oceans of blood for their cause, whether that was for God or for gold.
Okay, so to make sense of this whole sprawling conflict, we're going to break it down. First, we'll look at how the church strikes back. Then, we'll turn to Spain's iron-fisted king. After that, France's bloody civil war. Then, it's England's queen versus an entire empire. And finally, we'll see how a continent was redrawn when the dust finally settled.
All right, so first up, the Catholic Church. They're facing this massive Protestant revolt, right? And they know they can't just sit back and watch it happen. They had to do something. They had to reform from the inside out and get their authority back. And that's exactly what the Catholic Reformation was all about.
In the centerpiece of this whole Counter-Reformation, it was something called the Council of Trent. Think about this. For almost 20 years, church leaders met to figure out their game plan. So were they going to compromise with the Protestants? No way. Instead, they just doubled down. They drew a really hard line, condemned Protestant beliefs, and at the same time, they started cleaning house, tackling all the corruption that had made them vulnerable to begin with.
And really, it was a brilliant two-pronged attack. On one hand, you clarify the rules. The Pope is the boss, period, and there's no room for compromise. On the other hand, you build a brand new kind of army. We're not talking about soldiers with swords here. We're talking about priests sworn to absolute, unquestioning obedience. These were the Jesuits, founded by a former soldier of all people, to be the Pope's loyal shock troops.
And you know what? This army was incredibly effective. The Jesuits became the schoolmasters of Catholic Europe. They were so good, in fact, that even some Protestants would send their own kids to Jesuit schools. Think about that. But their ambition wasn't just European. It was global. They set up missions literally all over the world, from Japan to Brazil, becoming this huge international force for Catholicism.
And the Jesuits, they understood the power of spectacle. They got it. It wasn't just about preaching and teaching. They built things. Look at this. They put up these magnificent, absolutely gorgeous churches, like this one in Venice, that were basically giant physical statements. They shouted, "We are powerful, we are confident, and we are back."
Okay, so this is where things really start to escalate, because the church had a #1 ally, and he just happened to be the most powerful man in Europe, King Philip II of Spain. He truly saw himself as the sword of the Catholic faith, and he was absolutely determined to stamp out heresy wherever he found it in his massive empire.
And when I say his empire was massive, I mean it. This was the original empire on which the sun never set. We're talking everything from the silver mines in the Americas to the super-rich trading ports of the Netherlands. He had just immense wealth and power at his fingertips. And he had one single driving mission: use all of it to enforce Catholic-only rule.
So where does he focus first? The Netherlands, which was just a hotbed of Protestantism. And his method? It wasn't about debate or persuasion. Nope, it was pure brute force. He unleashed the Inquisition. That's the church's feared heresy court. And he sent in this remorseless guy, the Duke of Alva, who created what was literally called a reign of terror. He executed thousands of people and became this absolute symbol of tyranny.
But, oppression always breeds resistance. And the Dutch found their leader, William, Prince of Orange. His story is actually really similar to George Washington's, just a couple centuries earlier. Here's a guy taking on a seemingly hopeless task, trying to free his people from a super-powerful king, fighting an empire with, well, a small band of rebels.
And the thing about William was he lost a lot of battles. Battle after battle. But he was never, ever conquered. That resilience he showed, it inspired the northern provinces to finally band together. In 1579, 7 of them create this new union, and then, just 2 years after that, they make it official. They declare independence from Spain. And just like that, the Dutch Republic is born.
Now, while all this is happening, while Spain is totally bogged down fighting in the Netherlands, its biggest rival, France, is basically tearing itself apart. The conflict there between Catholics and the French Protestants, who are called Huguenots, just explodes into one of the most brutal civil wars Europe has ever seen.
And it all came to this horrifying peak on St. Bartholomew's Day in 1572. A single order from the royals and the killing started. It was a coordinated massacre of Huguenots that just swept through Paris. In the city alone, the streets literally ran red with the blood of at least 2,000 people, men, women, and children.
And it didn't stop there. The violence spread from Paris out into the rest of the country like a wildfire. In the weeks that followed, it's estimated that at least 10,000 more Protestants were killed. I mean, this was an event that absolutely shocked the rest of Europe.
But out of all that chaos, a survivor emerges who would eventually become king. His name was Henry of Navarre. He was a Huguenot prince himself, and he barely escaped that massacre with his life. But after years of war and political maneuvering, he actually finds himself as the rightful heir to the entire French throne.
The thing about Henry, though, was that he was a pragmatist. He was practical above all else. And he had a huge choice to make. Was it going to be his faith or his kingdom? He knew he couldn't rule a country that was just devastated by war and was still mostly Catholic. So he chose the kingdom. He converted to Catholicism, and that's where we get that famous line, Paris was worth a mass.
All right, let's hop across the English Channel now. Because over in England, the very shrewd Protestant queen Elizabeth I was walking her own dangerous tightrope. She was dealing with Catholic plots against her at home and the massive, looming threat of the Spanish Empire abroad.
And at the heart of all this was a very personal and very political rivalry. You had Elizabeth, the Protestant queen, and her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, who was Catholic. Now, Mary had a very real claim to the English throne. For Catholics all over Europe, she was the rightful queen, the one who could finally bring England back into the Catholic fold.
So, you can imagine, tensions just escalated like crazy. First, Elizabeth really ticked off Philip of Spain by sending help to those Dutch rebels he was fighting. Then, Mary, Queen of Scots, gets caught up in another plot to kill Elizabeth, and this time she's executed. For Philip, that was it. That was the final straw. He decided it was time to stop messing around and just invade England.
So, Philip puts together this massive fleet, the biggest Europe had ever seen. They called it the Invincible Armada. The plan was simple. Sail to the Netherlands, pick up the Spanish army waiting there, and conquer England. But it didn't work. The Armada was outmaneuvered by England's smaller, quicker ships. And then, to top it all off, it was completely shattered by what the English called a Protestant wind. Basically, a monster storm that wrecked what was left of the fleet.
So after all this, decades of war, assassinations, invasions, what's the final score? Well, the grand ambitions of these great powers were pretty much checked. New nations were actually born out of the chaos, and the religious and political map of Europe, it was changed forever.
If you look at the final tally, you see this huge shift in the balance of power. Spain? Well, Philip's grand plan completely failed and the country began a long, slow decline. England? It was now safe from invasion and was going to stay Protestant. France? It was scarred for sure, but it was united again. And out of all those ashes, you have a brand new power on the scene, the independent Dutch Republic.
But here's the really crucial takeaway. While these wars settled some things, they left other issues dangerously unresolved. The tension between Protestant and Catholic countries didn't just disappear, it just shifted. And really, all of this was just a prelude, just the opening act for an even more devastating conflict that would swallow up Germany and most of Europe, the 30 Years' War. But that's a story for another time.